The first sign of winter was never loud. It did not arrive with a crash of thunder or the rumble of armies marching across fields. It came quietly, softly, with a change in the wind. Farmers felt it firsthand, edge to the air in the mornings, a chill that clung to the skin even as the sun rose. The trees whispered of it too, their leaves turning brittle, falling in spirals to the ground. To the wealthy, the season's arrival was a signal to prepare warm fires, fine cloaks, and indoor gatherings. But for the poor laborers, peasants, widows, orphans, it was a warning, almost a sentence, written into the sky itself. Winter was coming, and survival was never guaranteed. The lower classes lived in homes that were more fragile than they appeared. Thin wooden walls, patched with mud or straw, bore little protection against the cold winds that slipped through cracks. The roofs, thatched and often sagging, shed water poorly when snow began to fall. In autumn, when nights grew longer and tired, families hurried to repair what they could, gathering reeds, straw, and mud to fill gaps in their homes. But no matter how carefully they worked, the frost always found a way in. Children woke, shivering, their breaths forming small clouds in the dark, and parents wrapped them in scraps of cloth or straw. Fire was the most precious ally in winter, yet firewood was costly. Wealthy landowners claimed the forests, forbidding the poor from cutting trees. Gathering fallen branches was dangerous and often punished. So many poor families faced a bitter choice: spend what little coin they had on food or on fuel for the hearth. If they chose warmth, their stomachs ached. If they chose bread, their bodies froze. Many tried to stretch both burning dried dung or bits of straw, boiling thin gruel and hoping it would fill empty stomachs. Still, nights were long and merciless. Hunger was not sudden, but creeping. In the early days of winter, some food remained. From the harvest, bread was baked from coarse flour, porridge boiled from oats, beans, or barley. Dried vegetables might be added, if families had managed to keep them. But as weeks passed, stores ran low. The wealthy feasted in stone halls, where meat roasted on spits, but the poor learned to ration every crumb. Parents gave the larger portions to their children and went hungry themselves. Mothers pretended to have eaten already. Fathers tightened their belts and drank water to dull their hunger. The cold, of course, sharpened hunger into something more dangerous. Without proper food, bodies weakened and illness spread easily. Winter coughs that began as a tickle in the throat became feverish within days. Pneumonia, influenza, and lung infections carried many away, especially the elderly and the very young. A single cough in the night. Families had no medicine, only herbs, prayers, and the fragile hope that their loved ones were strong enough to fight through. Many were not. Children in particular bore the brunt of winter. Wrapped in whatever rags their families could find, they huddled together in corners, sometimes sleeping beside animals for warmth. In many villages, parents kept chickens or goats inside their homes during winter nights, not only for protection but also for the shared heat. It was a strange, cramped life, but the warmth of a living creature could mean the difference between life and death. Still, even with these desperate measures, the tiny bodies of children often gave out first. The smallest grave mounds in churchyards nearly always belonged to winter. The wealthy lived in another world entirely, while peasants walked barefoot through snow to fetch water from frozen streams. Nobles sat in fur-lined chambers, drinking warmed wine wrapped in heavy cloaks. They complained of draughts in stone halls, even as their servants shivered by empty hearths. For them, winter was an inconvenience, never a death sentence. For the poor, winter was a test they could never truly prepare for. And yet, even in such harshness, there was resilience. Families told stories by the hearth, sang songs to keep spirits alive, and prayed together in dark chapels lit only by a single candle. Hope was woven into every small act of survival, every loaf of bread baked thin, every blanket shared, every ember coaxed back to life. The first frost was just the beginning. As snow settled, hunger deepened, and nights stretched endlessly. The lower classes entered a season of quiet battle, a battle not against armies or kings, but against cold, hunger, and despair. Winter demanded strength, patience, and sacrifice. And though many fell, those who endured carried within them a silent courage that history rarely recorded, because history, so often written by the wealthy, told of battles and politics, inventions and discoveries. But in every winter, the real story lay in cottages where families whispered prayers over empty bowls, in villages where children wrapped in straw tried to sleep through the cold, and in graves dug into frozen ground. That was where the true cost of winter was written, in silence, in shadows, in the breath that turned to mist in the frozen night. As winter deepened, hunger became more than an ache in the belly. It turned into a shadow that followed families from morning until night, whispering at every meal, gnawing at every thought. In the early days of frost, when food stores had only begun to shrink, the poor still had the illusion of choice. Bread was baked thinner, stews stretched with more water, and what little salt remained was sprinkled sparingly. But soon, the question was not how to stretch a meal, and a bad autumn spelled disaster before winter even began. Grain rotted in damp storage bins, or rats chewed through what little was collected. Families who had counted on a good yield found themselves staring at half-empty sacks before the first snow had even fallen. Without markets bustling, without merchants bringing goods, the village economy withered. The poor had nothing to sell, and even if they had coin, there was little food to buy. Bread was the foundation of survival, yet bread itself became thinner and harder with every passing week. What began as loaves of coarse flour mixed with rye or barley turned by January into dark, bitter lumps filled with husks, seeds, or even ground acorns. Some baked bark into their bread. The wealthy could complain about bland banquets in their halls, but the poor were grateful for any crust that softened in their mouths. Children gnawed on hardened pieces until their gums bled, and mothers whispered lullabies to distract them from the hollow ache in their stomachs. Meat was rare, almost mythical. In many poor homes, a taste of meat came only once or twice in winter. Often at Christmas, when scraps from the Lord's table trickled down, those fortunate enough to keep a pig or goat often delayed slaughter as long as possible, waiting until the last moment when survival outweighed sentiment. The animals. Every part was used: flesh, bones, fat, even intestines, cleaned for storage. The act of slaughter was painful, for animals were not just food, they were wealth, they were companions, they were part of a family's fragile security. To lose one was to cut into the future. And when food ran out, people grew desperate. Some boiled weeds and roots pulled from frozen soil. Others scraped bark from trees, soaking it until it softened enough to chew. Entire families scoured fields for anything edible, though winter offered little. Even dogs and cats, once tolerated, became rivals for scraps. Hunger stripped dignity, replacing it with survival. The wealthy rarely saw this. Their tables remained full, though the luxuries of summer fresh fruit, soft cheeses, honey were gone. Still, they had bread, salted meat, dried fruit, and wine. They drank by the fire while their servants, gaunt and pale, swallowed hard as the sense of roasting meat drifted past them. To the poor, the divide between themselves and the wealthy was never more visible than in winter, when their bellies were empty while others feasted. Hunger did not only weaken the body, it weakened the mind. With little energy, laborers could not work as hard, could not fetch water or repair homes. Parents grew short-tempered, children wept at night. Families argued over crumbs, over whether to burn the last log now or wait until the coldest hour of the night. Hope grew thin, stretched like their porridge. Still, even in this bleakness, there were moments of humanity. Neighbors shared a loaf, even when their own shelves were nearly bare. A widow offered broth to a sick child from another family, though she herself had eaten nothing but boiled nettles. Priests organized meager distributions of bread from church stores, though they too could not feed everyone. It was in these small acts of kindness that survival often rested, not on the abundance of food, but on the willingness to share what little existed. For the lower class, hunger was not just a physical torment. It was a reminder of their place in the world, of the fragility of their existence. While kings planned campaigns and nobles measured their influence, peasants measured survival, one crust at a time. Winter stripped away all illusions. It revealed the harsh truth that the poor lived always on the edge of hunger. And in winter, that edge grew sharper than any blade, and as January turned to February, as frost hardened into ice, hunger's grip grew merciless. Many wondered not how they would greet spring, but whether they would see it at all. The cold was not just air. It was a presence, a weight, a constant reminder of winter's grip. For the poor, the cold did not simply sit outside their doors, entered their homes, slid through cracks in the walls, and settled into their bones. It was in the way water froze in wooden buckets left by the hearth. It was in the breath that clouded even indoors. It was in the stiffness of fingers, so numb that a mother could barely tie a child's cloth around them. In the wealthier homes of nobles and merchants, the cold was an inconvenience. Fires burned in large hearths, tapestries lined stone walls, and servants added logs as soon as flames began to die. But in the cottages of the poor, firewood was precious and flames were weak. Families gathered tightly around the single hearth. Bodies pressed close, sharing warmth like animals huddling in a den. The hearth was not just a place of comfort, it was survival itself. Without it, a home became little more than a cold shell, but would cost money, and money was scarce. Some families burned anything they could find: broken stools, bits of fencing, even straw that might otherwise have been used for bedding. Dried dung was collected and shaped into rough patties, stored carefully to be used as fuel. The smell was sharp, unpleasant, but it kept the flames alive. Yet even then, The fire was small, flickering, and families had to ration its light. They learned to sit in darkness, saving every ember for the night when the cold grew most merciless. The poor dressed themselves in layers, but those layers were thin. Clothes were patched again and again, wool threadbare, shoes worn until holes let in snow and ice. Children often wrapped their feet in rags or straw before slipping them into wooden clogs. Gloves were rare. Instead, hands were hidden inside sleeves or pressed against the skin of another for warmth. Nights were the worst, for blankets were few. Families slept huddled together, sometimes 3 or 4 to a bed, wrapped in every scrap of cloth they owned. Even then, they shivered. Illness thrived in the cold. A cough in December could become a fever by January, and a fever in a cold cottage often ended in death. Without warmth, the body weakened, unable to fight sickness. Mothers watched helplessly as children's lips turned blue, their tiny bodies shaking until exhaustion claimed them. The old suffered quietly, their joints stiffening until they could no longer rise from their beds. Cold was an enemy that did not strike with swords or arrows, but with silence, with exhaustion, with the slow closing of the body's strength. Yet there were small rituals that gave comfort. Families told stories. As they sat around the hearth, voices weaving tales of saints, heroes, and forgotten summers. Children listened with wide eyes, the flickering firelight dancing across their faces. In those moments, the cold seemed to retreat, just for a while, held at bay by warmth of voice and memory. The fire may have been small, but the stories burned brightly in their hearts. The church also played a role in these nights. Bells rang in the dark mornings, calling the faithful to prayer. Candles flickered in chapels where villagers gathered, their breath misting in the air, even inside holy walls. The poor prayed for warmth, for food, for survival. And though prayers did not banish the cold, they gave strength. Belief itself became a kind of fire, a glow against the freezing nights. But still, not all survived. When the cold was at its worst, some did not wake in the morning. Neighbors found them stiff in their beds, their thin blankets frozen with dew. Death by cold was quiet, almost merciful compared to starvation, came in sleep when shivering gave way to stillness. Graves were dug in frozen ground, shallow and hurried, marked by wooden crosses that would tilt and weather by spring. For the poor, winter was a thief. It stole warmth, it stole health, it stole lives. And yet, those who survived carried within them a strength that words rarely captured. They endured nights that seemed endless, days when fingers cracked and bled, mornings when frost painted every surface. They lived through what kings and nobles could not imagine. The cold was merciless, but the poor were resilient. They did not have furs, or endless wood, or halls filled with feasts. What they had was each other bodies, pressed close voices, telling stories, neighbors sharing what little they owned. It was not enough to erase the suffering, but it was enough, sometimes, to see another dawn. And so the cold crept on, day after day, night after night. It was inescapable, but not undefeatable. For every poor family that lit even the smallest flame, that shared even the thinnest blanket, that whispered even the simplest prayer, there was resistance. And that resistance, quiet as it was how the lower class endured the long winters that sought to claim them. Illness came in many forms during winter, but what made it most frightening was not its variety, was its persistence. The cold weakened the body, hunger hollowed it out, and together they opened the door for sickness to walk in, uninvited and merciless. For the lower class, there was no barrier strong enough to keep it out. It crept into every cottage, lingered in every cough, and grew stronger with every passing week of frost. In the early days of winter, when the first chills set in, people thought little of a cough or a runny nose. Children sniffled, men sneezed, women wrapped shawls tighter around their shoulders. But as days shortened and nights grew longer, those coughs deepened, rattling in the chest. A simple cold could turn to bronchitis. A sore throat became pneumonia. The body, already weakened by thin meals and endless shivering, had little strength left to fight. The poor had no doctors. Physicians, where they existed, were for the wealthy, their remedies costly, their services out of reach. Instead, villagers relied on healers, midwives, or old women who knew herbs and prayers. Dried thyme for coughs, garlic to ward off fever, honey when it could be found, all were used sparingly, though few cures truly helped when the illness came from cold itself. Sometimes a steaming pot of water was set beside the sick herbs thrown in, the vapors inhaled with desperate hope. Sometimes holy water was sprinkled over the bed. But more often than not, families simply waited and prayed. Coughing filled the nights. In one cottage, a father might cough so violently he could not sleep, while in another, a child wheezed until her tiny body trembled. The sound was everywhere, echoing through villages like the tolling of invisible bells. Families learned to live with it, though every cough reminded them of what could come next: fever, weakness, and too often, death. When fever struck, the body burned in a cruel paradox, shivering from cold while burning with heat. Blankets were piled high, but they did little. Sweat-soaked rags, chills followed, and still the fever raged. The sick spoke in delirium, muttering prayers, sometimes screaming. Children clung to mothers in confusion. And when the fever broke, relief was sharp but brief. For many, it only returned, stronger than before. The elderly were especially vulnerable. Already weakened by years of labor, they had little strength to endure the long winter nights. A single illness could carry them off. Many families lost grandparents during winter, and though grief was heavy, it was accompanied by a quiet resignation. People expected winter to claim the old, just as it claimed the young. Death in winter was not unusual. It was part of the season as much as snow or frost. And still, families fought. They fought with what little they had: hot broth made from scraps of bone, heated stones wrapped in cloth placed by the sick to provide warmth, whispered prayers repeated over and over. Mothers sat by the beds of their children, holding small hands through the night, counting each breath with fear. Fathers worked harder, gathering anything to trade for food that might restore strength. Neighbors visited, offering herbs or bread, even when they had little to give. In the darkness of winter, illness revealed not only fragility, but also compassion. But there were moments when compassion was not enough. In every village, there came a time when bells rang for the dead. Funerals in winter were quiet, cold affairs. The ground was frozen, so graves were shallow, dug with great difficulty. Bodies were wrapped in cloth or placed in simple coffins if the family could afford it. Families huddled together, their breath misting in the air as prayers were spoken. Quickly in the biting wind, the poor had no marble headstones, only wooden crosses that weathered and cracked with time. By spring, many graves were unmarked, the names of the dead fading into memory. Illness did not just take lives, it disrupted the fragile balance of survival. When a father was bedridden, fields went untended, repairs left undone. When a mother fell ill, children were left hungry, chores abandoned. A sick child brought worry so heavy that parents neglected themselves. In households already living on the edge, one illness could tip the balance entirely. What made it worse was that illness was everywhere, invisible and unstoppable. It passed from person to person in cramped cottages, carried by breath, by touch, by the very air. Families could not separate the sick from the healthy. They all lived in one room, shared one bed, breathed the same air. There was no escape for the poor. Winter illness was more than just a season of colds. It was a trial of endurance, a test of patience, faith, and sheer will. Some survived, scarred and weary, their coughs lingering into spring. Others never woke from their fevers. And while nobles might complain of winter drafts in their stone castles, the poor knew a truth carved deep into their bones. Winter was not just weather, it was an enemy, and sickness was its sharpest weapon. Still, even in this dark truth, there was resilience. The poor endured, not because they were untouched by illness, but because they learned to carry grief alongside survival. They buried their dead, mourned their losses, and then rose again, chopping wood, tending fires, stretching food. Life demanded it. Winter demanded it. And so they pressed on, through coughs, through fevers, through endless nights, because to survive winter was not simply to live it, was to endure in spite of suffering, to keep moving forward when every breath was heavy, when every day carried the weight of sickness and cold. It was not glory nor triumph, it was persistence. And persistence, quiet as it was, became its own kind of victory. Winter did not only strip food from the poor, it stripped comfort, dignity, and the illusion of safety. A house, no matter how carefully built, became a battleground against the season. For the wealthy, stone manors and castles offered thick walls, blazing hearths, and servants to maintain the fires. But for the poor, cottages of timber and thatch were frail defenses against wind, snow, and frost. The homes of peasants were often one-room structures, walls made from wattle and daub sticks woven together and covered with mud. In summer, such houses were sufficient, warm with the heat of the sun, filled with the smell of bread and soil. But in winter, mud cracked, gaps widened, and icy drafts slipped through unseen seams. Families stuffed holes with straw, cloth, or dried moss, patching the walls again and again, yet the cold always returned. The roof was another enemy. Thatched roofs, though warm in summer, sagged under heavy snow. Some collapsed, their timbers snapping in the night, leaving families scrambling to salvage what little they owned. Even when roofs held, they leaked dripping icy water onto bedding. Children woke in damp blankets, their bodies chilled, and illness followed soon after. The floor was no less cruel. Packed earth, hardened in summer, turned frozen in winter. The ground itself seemed to pull warmth from the body. Families spread rushes or straw across the floor, but as weeks passed, the bedding became damp, dirty, and filled with vermin. Rats and mice, searching for crumbs and warmth, scurried freely across the floorboards, gnawing on stored grain, darting between sleeping children. The poor often shared their shelter with their animals, goats, chickens, sometimes a pig, because the animal's body heat made the difference between freezing and surviving. The sound of clucking hens or the bleat of a goat became the nighttime lullaby of many families, and still the fire remained the heart of survival. It was not only warmth, but light, protection, and comfort. Without fire, the cottage was nothing more than a shell. Families rationed their wood carefully, deciding whether to burn a log in the afternoon when frost bit through walls, or to wait until night when the dark pressed heavy against the windows. They learned to sleep early, huddled in darkness to save fuel, rising at dawn with numb fingers to coax embers back to life. Yet wood was costly, and the poor could rarely afford to buy what they needed. Some risked gathering branches from forests owned by lords, but punishment for theft was harsh beatings, fines, even imprisonment. Others gathered twigs and brush from hedgerows, carrying home bundles too small to last even a day. Dried dung became common fuel, collected from animals and shaped into patties. The smoke was acrid, the flames weak, but it kept children alive through the coldest nights. Inside these cottages, families pressed close to share warmth. Parents slept beside children, covering them with every ragged cloth they owned. Some families shared one bed, others lay together on straw, limbs tangled, breath warming one another's faces. In such closeness, there was comfort, but also risk. When sickness came, it spread swiftly through these cramped quarters, leaving none untouched. The poor built small rituals to endure. Before bed, prayers were whispered, not only for health and food, but for the fire to last until morning. Mothers tucked children in with tales of saints who endured hunger, of kings who ruled wisely, of warm summers that would return. Fathers sharpened tools by the hearth, the steady rasp of stone on metal filling the silence, each strike a reminder that spring must eventually come. Neighbors, too, became part of survival. When one roof collapsed, others helped rebuild it, even if their own homes were fragile. When one family's fire died, another shared embers. Community became a shield against despair, a network of shared suffering and quiet generosity. In winter, no one could truly survive alone. Yet even with these efforts, the truth was harsh. Shelter for the poor was fragile, temporary, and vulnerable. Each gust of wind was a threat, each snowstorm a test, each night a gamble. Families lived not in security, but in constant fear that their homes would betray them. Still, what amazes us, looking back, is not simply the hardship, but the endurance. The poor endured walls that crumbled, roofs that leaked, and fires that barely glowed. They endured sickness, vermin, hunger, and fear. And yet every winter, some emerged into spring, faces thin but eyes bright, proof of a resilience that history rarely recorded. The cottages of the poor were not castles. They were not fortresses of stone. They were humble shelters of wood, straw, and mud. But within those walls, lives were lived, families clung together, and the long war against winter was fought one night at a time. And in the silence of those frozen nights, as snow blanketed fields and the wind howled through the trees, the poor whispered prayers and stories, finding warmth not only in fire but in each other. The body can endure hunger. It can shiver through nights without warmth, scrape by on little more than crusts of bread and bitter herbs. But what truly wears a person down is not only the physical pain, it is the heaviness of spirit, the gnawing despair that winter brings. For the lower classes, survival in winter was as much a battle of the mind as it was of the flesh. As the first frosts painted the ground white, there was a sense of dread. Families knew what was coming: the shortening of days, the long black nights, the empty larders, the coughing children, the ache in the chest that whispered sickness. People braced themselves, not with confidence, but with resignation, like soldiers marching into a war they could not win, only endure. The sun itself became a stranger. In summer it had poured over the fields, golden and generous, but in winter it rose reluctantly, weak and pale, before sinking again into darkness. The poor worked in the dim light of dawn and dusk, their hands stiff, their breath clouding the air. Hours of light were precious, but they never seemed enough. Darkness came early, filling cottages with silence. To live in winter was to live in half-light, to forget what warmth and brightness felt like. Silence was another burden. In winter, nature itself grew still. Birds vanished, fields lay empty, rivers froze. The countryside, once alive with voices of animals and rustling leaves, became hushed, almost dead. For peasants who lived close to the land, this silence felt like the world itself had turned its back on them. And then there was fear. Fear of the cold, of hunger, of illness. Fear of wolves at the edge of the forest, their howls carried on the wind. Fear of roofs collapsing under snow. Fear of debts that could not be paid, of taxes that came even when bellies were empty. Winter sharpened every fear, every vulnerability. Children sensed it too. They asked their mothers if food would last, if the fire would stay lit, if the snow would ever stop. Mothers comforted them with soft words, though their own hearts trembled. Fathers spoke of spring, of planting, of the return of green fields, though they too feared not all would live to see it. Illness was the shadow that winter carried everywhere. Cold cramped the lungs, dampness bred fevers, hunger weakened the body, until even a small sickness became deadly. A cough could last for weeks, echoing through the cottage walls. Small children wasted away in silence. Old men and women closed their eyes one night and did not open them again. Death was not a distant possibility. In winter it was a constant companion, always listening, always waiting. And yet, despite all this, the human spirit did not break so easily. Faith became a lifeline. Churches offered not only prayer, but a sense of belonging, a reminder that suffering was shared. Priests spoke of endurance, of Christ's own trials, of heavenly rewards waiting beyond earthly pain. Even the poorest could cling to the hope that their suffering had meaning, that their hunger and cold were not in vain. Candles lit in small chapels glowed like beacons in the endless dark. Fragile flames that whispered, "You are not forgotten." Stories, too, became survival. In long nights when wind rattled shutters and fires burned low, families told tales, folk tales, of heroes, of saints, of clever peasants outwitting cruel lords. These stories wove hope into the silence, carried children to warmer places in their dreams. In every tale was a reminder: suffering was not forever. Spring would come, just as heroes triumphed, just as saints endured. There was also laughter, surprisingly tender and brave. Children played even in the snow, their cheeks red, their laughter echoing across frozen fields. Neighbors shared jokes as they mended tools or gathered sticks. The poor found ways to smile, because to live without joy, even briefly, was to give winter victory. The rhythm of days became a kind of anchor. Morning chores, feeding animals, gathering water, repairing walls, tending the fire. These acts, small as they were, gave structure to endless cold weeks. Routine kept despair at bay, reminding people that life, though harsh, still moved forward. But still, the weight of winter pressed heavily on the soul. It was not just hunger, nor cold, nor sickness. It was the feeling of being trapped, of time itself frozen. It was the long wait for a dawn that seemed reluctant to return. For the poor, every winter was a season of testing, a trial of both body and spirit. Some did not endure, but those who did carried scars, not on their skin, but in their hearts. When spring finally came, when snow melted into streams, when green shoots broke the frozen earth, the poor felt not only relief but awe. Survival itself was a miracle. To step into a field again, to feel the warmth of sun on bare skin, was to taste joy deeper than words could hold. For those who endured, winter taught a lesson, harsh but true, that the human soul is stronger than it knows, that even when the world is stripped bare, when warmth is stolen and hope tested, people can still find strength in faith, in stories, in each other. And though history often overlooks these quiet victories, each one mattered. Each child who laughed despite hunger, each mother who whispered a comforting lie to ease her child's fear, each father who lit a fire one more night. These were the unseen triumphs of the poor, the courage that endured long winters with nothing but fragile hope. Winter was never endured alone. For the lower classes, survival depended not only on the strength of one family, but on the collective resilience of the village. A single household might falter, but when neighbors stood together, hope could be stretched a little further, like broth watered down but still warm in the belly. The village was the poor man's fortress. Its cottages, clustered close, broke the wind. Its people, bound by shared hardship, watched over each other with unspoken loyalty. In summer, when fields were green and harvest was plentiful, friendships seemed simple. But in winter, those bonds became lifelines. When the snow thickened, men walked together to gather wood from distant groves, breaking branches, splitting logs, hauling them back in sleds or on bent shoulders. Alone, a man might freeze before reaching home. Together, they could cut through drifts, share the weight, and warm themselves with laughter. A shouted joke or a remembered song could make the cold feel lighter. Food was shared as well. It was not unusual for a neighbor to send over a crust of bread, a bowl of thin stew, or a few carrots kept hidden from the frost. In return, kindness would circle back, sometimes in bread, sometimes in the labor of mending a roof or tending a sick child. The poor had little, yet in giving to each other, they found wealth of another kind: trust, the village oven, where bread was baked communally. was often a beacon in the dark months. Families carried their small lumps of dough to be cooked in the great heat, the scent of baking bread spilling into the cold air. Children clustered around, their cheeks flushed from the glow, eyes shining at the sight of rising loaves. That oven was more than stone, and fire it was a place of gathering, of warmth, of reassurance that life still went on. Winter also drew people into shared rituals. Church bells marked the passing of time, calling the faithful to prayer. Inside, the cold was pushed back by candlelight, voices rising in hymns that echoed against wooden beams. Faith was communal as much as personal. To kneel together, to sing together, was to remember that no one suffered alone. The poorest found dignity in that unity. Villages invented their own small celebrations, too. A feast on the darkest night of the year, even if it was nothing more than bread dipped in broth, could lift spirits. Children were told folk tales by the fire. Neighbors exchanged stories. Songs were sung not to forget hunger, but to hold it at bay. Laughter, even hollow-bellied, carried power. There were also roles that each person played. The elderly, though frail, carried memory, teaching remedies for coughs, prayers for protection, or wisdom about signs in the snow and sky. Women, resourceful beyond measure, patched clothes, stretched meals, and kept the fire alive. Men hauled wood, tended animals, and repaired what winter broke. Even children contributed, gathering twigs, carrying water, or keeping an eye on younger siblings while mothers worked. The poorest of the poor, those without family or hearth, were not always abandoned. Villages often found space for them in barns or corners of cottages. No one had much, but leaving a man to freeze in the snow was seen as a cruelty too deep to bear. A bowl of porridge, a shared blanket, these were the offerings of human decency, survival's quiet mercy. Still, tensions simmered. Hunger made tempers short, and when food grew scarce, generosity shrank. Accusations of hoarding or theft stirred suspicion. At night, doors were bolted, not only against wolves, but against desperate men. The line between neighbor and rival blurred when survival was at stake. Yet even in those moments, communities found ways back to each other, for division meant doom, while unity gave at least a chance. Winter also brought hidden forms of barter. A man with strong arms might chop wood for a widow in exchange for a loaf of bread. A woman skilled in spinning might trade woolen mittens for milk. Exchange kept life moving when coins were rare and markets too far to reach. The poor relied on each other, not just for survival, but for dignity, the dignity of still giving, still having something to offer, even in the harshest months. When spring finally came, villages emerged not just as survivors, but as testaments to the strength of community. Each life saved was the result of countless unseen acts of a borrowed log, a shared bowl, a neighbor's hand on a frozen night. Winter tested individuals, but it measured the soul of the village as a whole. And though history often records kings, wars, and nobles, the true triumphs were found herein: cottages of mud and timber, in hands blistered from work, in hearts that refused to abandon one another. The poor had little, but together they carried each other through winter. That was their true wealth: solidarity, the warmth of shared humanity, glowing against the endless cold. Winter did not permit idleness. Even in the poorest cottages, where food was scarce and bones were weary, The days were filled with endless tasks. Work was survival, and to let the hands rest too long was to risk losing the fragile thread that kept life tied to the body. The first labor was always the fire. At dawn, when frost still clung to the inside of the cottage walls and breath rose in pale clouds, someone, often the mother, knelt by the hearth. She coaxed embers from the ashes of last night, blowing gently, adding twigs and dried moss until a flame caught. Children hovered close, shivering, waiting for the warmth to spread. Without fire, there was no life, no heat, no food, no light against the endless dark. Wood was therefore more precious than gold. Men trudged into the forest, axes in hand, their boots crunching over ice, to fell trees or gather fallen branches. The labor was brutal. Arms ached, fingers numbed, sweat froze on brows. Logs were split and hauled back through snow, heavy loads dragging behind on sleds or carts. A man might return home exhausted, yet his family greeted him as though he carried treasure, for indeed he did. Every log was another night survived. Fetching water was no less vital and no less punishing. Wells froze, buckets slipped from numb hands, and icy paths threatened to send water spilling before it reached the hearth. Children were often sent on these errands, their small figures trudging bravely with pails larger than their heads. Each trip was a trial, yet without it, pots remained empty, and no broth could simmer, no clothes could be washed, no thirst animals, too, demanded care. Even the poorest peasants often kept a goat, a few chickens, or a pig. These creatures were lifelines, providing milk, eggs, or meat when times grew desperate. But they too suffered the winter. Barn doors had to be secured against the wind. Hay had to be rationed carefully. Weak animals had to be warmed with straw. A cow lost to frost was more than an animal gone. It was months of milk vanished, survival cut shorter. Children slept in barns beside animals, their small bodies lending heat to the beasts, while the beasts' warmth, in turn, kept the children alive. Clothing was another battlefield. Woolens had to be patched, shoes mended, mittens knitted from scraps. Women worked tirelessly, fingers stiff, needles flashing in the dim light of the hearth. Old garments were unraveled so their threads could be rewoven into something new. Every stitch was a defense against the cold creeping in. Food preparation was itself a constant task. Thin stews were stretched with roots, dried peas, or scraps. Of meat, bread was baked from flour mixed with rye or oats, often so coarse it cut the gums. Herbs preserved from summertime, sage, marjoram, were dropped into pots, not only for taste, but in hope of warding off sickness. Children chewed on roasted chestnuts or parsnips when no bread was left, their teeth aching from the hardness. Every meal was humble, but each was a victory over hunger. Repairs filled whatever hours remained. Roofs sagged under snow and had to be cleared before collapse. Doors rattled in the wind and needed reinforcement with extra boards. Holes in walls were stuffed with straw or mud, every crack sealed against drafts. Tools, too, required attention: axes sharpened, buckets patched, sled runners repaired. For the poor, there was no store to replace what broke. Each item was precious, every repair an act of necessity. winter also dictated rhythms of indoor labor. Women spun wool into thread, their distaffs and spindles turning endlessly, the soft hum filling cottages as snow fell outside. Children braided ropes, carved wooden toys, or learned simple stitches. Men mended harnesses, shaped handles, or crafted small tools by the glow of the fire. These labors not only prepared for survival, but passed the long hours, giving hands purpose when minds risked despair. Evening was no time for rest either. Fires had to be stoked, animals checked one last time, snow swept from paths to prevent morning drifts. Families gathered by the hearth, weary but still busy mending clothes, telling stories, nursing the sick. Life never paused. Winter allowed no true ease. Every task carried weight. To fetch water was not just to fill a bucket, but to keep thirst at bay. To mend a roof was not just carpentry, but the prevention of death by cold. To knit mittens was not just craft, but armor against frostbite. Each act, however ordinary, was survival disguised in simple labor, and yet, despite exhaustion, there was pride in this work. Fathers taught sons the rhythm of chopping wood. Mothers showed daughters how to stretch a meal from almost nothing. Skills were passed down not as lessons, but as lifelines. Knowledge, preserved in calloused hands and weary hearts, was as vital as food or fire. For the poor, winter was not survived through miracles or luck, but through labor, the constant, grinding, unglamorous labor that filled every day and every night. Work was suffering, yes, but it was also resilience. Each task, done faithfully, was a defiance against the cold, a whispered refusal to surrender to death. For the poor, winter was not only a season of cold and hunger, it was also a season of mystery, when the veil between the living and the unseen seemed thinner. In the silence of long nights, when winds howled around cottages and shadows stretched across frozen fields, imagination filled the darkness with spirits, omens, and unseen powers. Folktales whispered that the winter wind was no ordinary wind, but the breath of restless souls wandering the earth. Some said it carried the voices of ancestors, urging the living to endure. Others believed it was punishment, a reminder from heaven or from old pagan gods that life was fragile, that suffering was written into the bones of the world. Superstition wove itself into every corner of survival. If the first snow of the year fell heavy, it was said to be an omen of hardship, a sign that the poor should prepare for hunger. A bird seen flying north in December was taken as a warning of illness to come. The crack of ice on the river could be a message from God or from spirits lurking beneath. Animals carried meanings to an owl hooting near a cottage meant death might visit before the thaw. A dog howling at night foretold misfortune. On the other hand, a fox crossing the path was seen as good luck, a promise of cleverness and survival. Children listened to these sayings wide-eyed, taking comfort in the idea that the world, even in its cruelties, sent messages they could understand to protect themselves. The poor leaned on rituals passed down through generations. A sprig of holly hung above the door, a charm against spirits. Ashes from the Yule fire sprinkled around a cottage kept evil at bay. Mothers whispered prayers while stirring pots, marking crosses on the lids to bless whatever thin broth simmered. Within winter holidays, especially midwinter feasts, carried deep meaning. For many centuries, long before Christianity spread fully, villages lit fires on the darkest night, believing that flame itself helped call back the sun. Later, Christian festivals like Christmas and Candlemas absorbed these old traditions, offering new prayers but keeping the ancient comfort that light, whether from bonfires or candles, could drive back the dark. Storytelling was perhaps the strongest weapon against despair. Around the hearth, families told tales of saints who endured hardship, of peasants who outwitted lords, of magical creatures who punished greed but rewarded kindness. Each story was more than entertainment, it was instruction, hope, and a way of giving shape to the chaos of life. Children grew up with legends of frost spirits who painted windows with icy patterns. Some were told of Jack Frost, a trickster who nipped fingers and toes but spared those who respected the cold. Others heard of the Wild Hunt, ghostly riders sweeping across the night sky, a warning that death moved abroad during the long months. Even hunger found its reflection in stories. There were tales of magical feasts appearing to the righteous, or of enchanted pots that refilled themselves. These stories, born from empty bellies, gave children something to dream of, a world where no one went without, where warmth and food flowed endlessly. Superstitions also touched the smallest tasks. Bread baked unevenly might be a sign of bad luck. A candle flickering wildly in a still room meant a spirit was present. The sound of crows gathering near a cottage was taken as an omen that someone inside might not live to see spring. But not all was fear. Some superstitions brought comfort. It was said that snow falling gently at night meant angels were passing overhead, covering the world with silence to remind people of peace. Icicles hanging long and straight were seen as gifts of purity, a promise that winter would end cleanly. When the first green shoot pushed through snow, it was believed to be a sign that souls of the dead had blessed the land with renewal. These beliefs, half pagan and half Christian, half fear and half hope, wrapped the poor in a cloak of meaning. In a world that offered little explanation for suffering, stories gave answers, superstitions gave control. However fragile, and faith woven from old myths and new prayers, gave people the strength to face another day. For the lower classes, winter was not only a season of death, it was also a season of stories, of traditions, of mystery that filled the long nights. And though hunger gnawed and cold bit, the imagination offered a fire of its own, one that kept despair from turning into hopelessness. The cruelty of winter always felt endless while it lasted. Weeks stretched into months, days blurred together in the half-light, and every morning seemed to begin with the same question: how much longer can we endure? For the poor, winter was not only a season but a test of body, spirit, and faith. Yet even the longest winter had an ending, and even the coldest frost could not stop the turning of the earth. The first signs of spring were small, almost invisible: a trickle of water beneath the ice, a crow's caw echoing differently, sharper in the warming air, a patch of earth where snow melted first, dark and wet, promising life to come. Children noticed these things before their elders dared to believe. They ran to their mothers, breathless, holding a green shoot between their fingers, shouting that winter was dying. The thaw brought relief, but not all at once. Snow retreated slowly, Rivers swelled with ice water, and mud clung thick to boots. Yet each day grew longer, and each morning carried more light. The sun, once weak and pale, began to shine with a strength that seemed almost miraculous. It touched frozen faces, thawed stiff fingers, and filled tired hearts with new warmth for those who had survived. Spring was not just another season, it was a resurrection. The hunger that had stalked families through the long dark months began to loosen its grip. Fields softened under the plow, seeds were planted, and the promise of harvest returned. Chickens laid eggs more plentifully, cows gave richer milk, and herbs sprouted green at cottage doors. After months of scarcity, even the simplest food felt like a feast. Villages came alive with sound again. Children's laughter rang across fields as they played in the thawing earth. Hammers echoed as men repaired roofs and carts damaged by snow. Women hung washed clothes in the breeze, their bright fabrics flapping like banners of victory. The silence of winter gave way to the music of life-bird song, flowing rivers and voices carrying across open air. But spring also revealed the cost. Graves stood fresh in the churchyard, marked by wooden crosses, reminders of those who had not endured. Some cottages remained shuttered, their fires long gone out. For every family that celebrated survival, another grieved. Winter always demanded a toll, and the poor paid it in lives as much as in suffering. Yet even grief was tempered by gratitude. The living gave thanks not because they had been spared pain, but because they had been granted another chance. They honored the dead with prayers, with stories, with whispered promises to remember. And then they turned to the fields, to the animals, to the children, because survival meant moving forward, always forward. The lessons of winter lingered. Every log stacked in the summer was valued more deeply, every grain of wheat cherished, every stitch of cloth respected. Families prepared with new urgency, knowing how narrow the line between life and death could be. Hardship carved wisdom into the poor, teaching them resilience, patience, and, above all, the strength of community. For, though the records of kings and nobles rarely mentioned them, these quiet victories mattered. The poor were not knights or lords, yet they fought a war of their own each year against hunger, cold, and despair. Their weapons were simple fire, bread, labor, kindness. Their battlefield was the cottage, the barn, the frozen field, and their victories, though uncelebrated by history, were no less real. In every laugh of a child, in every loaf of bread shared, in every fire that burned through a long night, there was a triumph. Survival itself was the victory. And when the sun finally set on the last night of winter, when the air carried warmth once more, and the land stirred back to life, the poor stood as proof of something greater than suffering, the endurance of the human spirit. They had been tested by hunger, by cold, by fear, and by death itself. Yet still they rose with the thaw, shoulders bent but hearts unbroken, ready to sow, to build, to live again. Winter was a death sentence for many, but for those who endured, spring was not only a season, it was a miracle.